On September 12, 1831, in the sweltering rice plantations surrounding Georgetown, South Carolina, a planter named Alistair Finch was found dead in his library. His skull had been crushed with such astonishing force that the physicians examining the body reported finding bone fragments embedded in the mahogany desk 6 feet away. The coroner's report, still preserved in the Georgetown County Archives, described injuries consistent with compression by hands of extraordinary size and strength, exceeding normal human capacity. The only suspect was a woman who stood 6 feet 8 inches tall, weighed over 240 pounds of solid muscle, and had vanished into the humid September night without a trace. For nearly 2 centuries, local historians have debated whether Hannah Cole really existed, or if she was merely a legend born from the guilt and fear of a brutal era. But the medical records, sale documents, and eyewitness testimonies that have survived suggest something far more disturbing: that she was absolutely real, and that what happened in that library was the inevitable, violent conclusion of a horror that had been building for years. Before we continue with the story of Hannah Cole and the night that shocked Georgetown society into a silence that lasted for generations, I want to ask you something. If you are fascinated by true historical mysteries that blur the line between documented fact and terrifying legend, hit that subscribe button right now. And please leave a comment telling me what state or city you are listening from. I read every single one, and I love knowing that these forgotten American stories are reaching people all across the country. Now, let's step back to where this nightmare truly began. The story of Hannah Cole does not start with violence. It starts, as so many stories in the antebellum South did, with money. In the spring of 1827, the port of Georgetown was experiencing one of its busiest trading seasons in decades. Ships arrived weekly from the Caribbean, from West Africa, and from the tobacco fields of Virginia, all carrying human cargo to be sold at the markets on Front Street. Georgetown was not just a port city, it was the beating heart of the domestic slave trade in the rice-growing regions of South Carolina. A place where fortunes were made through the buying and selling of human beings, with the same casual, brutal efficiency as rice barrels or indigo dyes. The rice plantations that surrounded Georgetown were particularly notorious operations. Unlike the cotton fields further inland, rice cultivation required workers to stand in water for hours at a time, in swamps teeming with malaria-carrying mosquitoes, venomous water moccasins, and alligators. The death rate among the enslaved workers on these plantations was staggering. Some historical estimates suggest that nearly 30% of the people forced to work in the rice fields died within their first year. The work was so dangerous, so exhausting, so deadly that plantation owners had a constant, insatiable need to purchase new workers to replace those who had perished. This created a perverse and predatory economy. Slave traders scoured the southern states looking for strong, healthy workers who could withstand the unique brutality of the rice swamps. And occasionally they found something unusual, something that would fetch an extraordinary price on the auction block. In March of 1827, a slave trader named Silas Croft arrived in Georgetown with a coffle of 37 people he had purchased in the Piedmont region of North Carolina. Among them was a young woman, perhaps 19 or 20 years old, who immediately drew the attention of everyone who saw her for one unmistakable reason: she was enormous. Contemporary accounts from the auction house records describe her as standing near 7 feet in height, with a frame of unusual breadth and musculature. Witnesses at the auction reported that she had to duck to enter doorways and that her hands were so large they could wrap entirely around a man's head. Her name, according to the auction documents, was Hannah. No last name was recorded, as was common practice. She had been born on a small farm in rural North Carolina, the daughter of an enslaved woman whose own name has been lost to history. From the scattered records that survive, it appears that Hannah suffered from a condition that modern medicine would recognize as pituitary gigantism, a rare disorder caused by an excess of growth hormone, typically due to a benign tumor on the pituitary gland. In the 1820s, however, no such medical understanding existed. To the people who saw her, Hannah was simply a freak of nature, a curiosity and potentially a very valuable one. The auction took place on a humid Tuesday morning in late March. The auction house on Front Street was packed with planters, merchants, and curious onlookers who had heard the rumors about the giant woman. When Hannah was brought onto the platform, still shackled at the wrists and ankles, a murmur rippled through the crowd. She stood nearly a full head taller than the auctioneer, a portly man named James Ashworth, who had conducted thousands of these sales but admitted later to his friends that he had never seen anything quite like her. The bidding started at $400, an already substantial sum for a female field hand. Within minutes, it had climbed to $800, then $1,000. Planters shouted their offers, each trying to outbid the other. Seeing in Hannah not just a worker but a spectacle, someone who could draw visitors to their plantation, someone who could be displayed. The winning bid came from a man standing near the back of the room. His name was Alistair Finch, and he paid $1,300 for Hannah, one of the highest prices ever recorded for a single enslaved person at a Georgetown auction in that year. Finch was a rice planter who owned a mid-sized plantation called Cypress Bend, located about 18 miles southwest of Georgetown, deep in the network of tidal swamps and meandering rivers that characterized the Lowcountry. He was 42 years old, a widower, and had a reputation among the other planters as a man who ran his plantation with an iron fist. He had no patience for what he called softness in the managing of his enslaved workers. As Hannah was led away from the auction block, a new leather collar with Finch's property mark burned into it fastened around her neck. Witnesses reported that she never made a sound. She did not cry. She did not resist. She simply stared straight ahead with dark, unreadable eyes, her massive frame moving with a strange, quiet grace despite the heavy chains that bound her. No one at that auction could have known what they had just witnessed. They could not have known that they were watching the beginning of a story that would end in blood, mystery, and a legend that would haunt the Lowcountry for generations. But perhaps they should have suspected something. Because according to the records, as Finch led Hannah to his wagon for the long journey to Cypress Bend, one old woman in the crowd, a free black woman who sold flowers near the market, was heard to say, "That man just bought his own death." Cypress Bend Plantation was everything the Lowcountry was known for, and everything that made it a living hell for those forced to work there. The main house was a two-story structure built in the Georgian style with white columns and a wide veranda that overlooked the shimmering rice fields stretching toward the Waccamaw River. Behind the main house sat the usual collection of outbuildings: the kitchen, the overseer's cottage, a barn, a rice mill, and a row of 12 slave cabins made of rough-hewn timber with dirt floors and no windows. Beyond those lay the fields, hundreds of acres of carefully engineered rice paddies connected by an intricate system of dikes, ditches, and floodgates that controlled the tidal water essential for rice cultivation. When Hannah arrived at Cypress Bend in late March of 1827, she was assigned to cabin number 7, which she would share with 5 other women. The overseer, a thin, nervous man named Elias Thorne, seemed visibly unsettled by her size. In a letter he wrote to his brother, which still exists in the South Carolina Historical Society archives, he described Hannah as a creature of such unnatural dimensions that she must stoop to enter the cabin. And when she stands at her full height, she resembles some ancient colossus more than a Christian woman. But Alistair Finch had not paid $1,300 for Hannah simply to have her work in the fields. He had something else in mind. Within the first week of her arrival, Finch began exhibiting Hannah to his visitors. He would invite neighboring planters, Georgetown merchants, and even traveling gentlemen to Cypress Bend, specifically to see the giantess he had acquired. Hannah would be brought to the main house, made to stand in the parlor or on the front veranda and ordered to demonstrate her size and strength. Finch would have her lift heavy objects, barrels filled with rice, iron anvils, even full-grown pigs. He would stand next to her so his visitors could see the dramatic difference in their heights. He would have her extend her hands so that men could place their own hands inside hers and marvel at the difference. A diary entry from a Georgetown physician named Dr. Edmund Parrish, who visited Cypress Bend in May of 1827, provides a chilling glimpse into these exhibitions. Dr. Parrish wrote, "Mr. Finch has acquired a female specimen of most extraordinary proportions. She stands at least 6.5 feet in height, perhaps more, with hands and feet of such a dimension that I could scarcely credit my own measurements. Her strength appears commensurate with her size. I observed her lift a barrel of rice weighing no less than 300 pounds with apparent ease. Mr. Finch informs me that he has received numerous offers to purchase her, but he declines, as she has become quite the attraction in our county. I confess the sight of her produced in me an unsettling sensation, as if nature herself had been experimenting with proportions beyond the normal boundaries of the human form. For Hannah, these humiliating exhibitions were only the beginning of her suffering at Cypress Bend. When she was not being displayed for Finch's guests, she was put to work in the rice fields under conditions that would have broken most people within a matter of months. Rice cultivation in the South Carolina Lowcountry was backbreaking, dangerous labor. The workers would wade into the flooded fields before dawn, standing in water up to their thighs for 10 to 12 hours at a time, bent over in the scorching sun planting, weeding, or harvesting the rice. The brackish water was filled with leeches and water moccasins. The air hummed with thick clouds of mosquitoes. The heat was suffocating, made worse by the constant humidity rising from the swamps. Hannah's extraordinary size made her both an asset and a target in the fields. She could carry loads that would require 2 or 3 normal workers. She could operate the heavy wooden pestles used to thresh the rice with a speed and power that astounded even the overseer. But her visibility also made her vulnerable. When Finch wanted to make an example to demonstrate what happened to those who worked too slowly or showed any sign of defiance, he would often choose Hannah. Not because she had done anything wrong, but because punishing someone of her size sent a clear and terrifying message to the others. No one was beyond his reach. The punishments were savage. Historical records from rice plantations of the era document the common use of whipping posts, wooden stocks, and a device called the buck, where a person would be forced to sit with their knees drawn up, a stick placed under their knees and over their arms, effectively immobilizing them in an agonizing position for hours on end. Hannah experienced all of these. The overseer Thorne's letters mention at least 3 occasions during Hannah's first year at Cypress Bend, where she was publicly punished for insolence or for refusing to be exhibited. But Hannah did not break, at least not in the way Finch expected. According to the testimony of other enslaved people at Cypress Bend, testimony that would only be collected years later under very different circumstances, Hannah became someone the community both feared and relied upon. Her immense strength was used for the hardest tasks, moving the massive floodgates that controlled the water flow into the rice fields, hauling heavy timber for repairs, lifting boats out of the water for maintenance. But her presence was also a protective one. There were stories of her stepping between an overseer's whip and a child who was too young to work but was being beaten anyway. Stories of her carrying workers who had collapsed from heat exhaustion back to their cabins on her own back. Stories of her standing silently but immovably when Finch tried to separate mothers from their children during sales to other plantations. She spoke rarely. When she did, her voice was low and steady, carrying an authority that seemed at odds with her status as property. Some of the older enslaved people at Cypress Bend began to call her Tall Hannah, or simply the Wall, because once she had decided to stand somewhere, it seemed that nothing could move her except by overwhelming force. and Alistair Finch was beginning to realize that force alone might not be enough to control her. The first serious confrontation between Alistair Finch and Hannah Cole occurred in the summer of 1828, about 15 months after her arrival at Cypress Bend. A Georgetown gentleman named Augustus Peyton, having heard about the giant slave woman, traveled to the plantation with a tantalizing offer. He would pay Finch $300 to bring Hannah to Georgetown for 2 weeks to display her at a traveling exhibition he was organizing, a collection of curiosities of nature and science. The exhibition was to include preserved animal specimens, strange mechanical devices, and, as its living centerpiece, Hannah. Finch agreed immediately. The prospect of earning a significant sum of money while simultaneously raising his own profile in Georgetown society was too tempting to refuse. He informed Hannah of the arrangement, expecting her to comply as she always had, with that same quiet, unreadable stoicism. But this time something was different. According to the testimony of a house servant named Clara who was present during the conversation, Hannah looked directly at Finch and said, her voice very quiet but firm, "I will not go." Finch was stunned. In the year and a half he had owned Hannah, she had never directly refused an order. He repeated the command, his own voice, rising with anger. Hannah repeated her refusal, her voice remaining steady and low. Finch's face flushed a deep, mottled red. He bellowed for the overseer, Elias Thorne. He ordered Hannah to be taken to the whipping post immediately. What happened next became a legend among the enslaved community at Cypress Bend, a story that would be whispered in the quarters for years to come. 4 men, including the overseer Thorne, attempted to force Hannah toward the post. She did not fight them. Not in the way they expected. She simply stopped moving. She planted her feet in the soft earth and became an immovable object, a living statue of defiance. The 4 men pulled, pushed, and even struck her with their fists and a cane, but Hannah would not budge. It took 8 men, using heavy ropes and finally resorting to threatening to harm other enslaved people if she did not comply, before Hannah finally and with a slow, deliberate grace walked to the post. The punishment was severe, 30 lashes with a braided leather whip. Witnesses reported that Hannah made no sound during the brutal beating, even as the whip tore through the rough cotton of her dress and left deep, bleeding gashes on her back. When it was over and she was finally released from the post, she walked back to her cabin without assistance, her back a shredded ruin, but her posture as upright and as unyielding as ever. She did not go to Georgetown. Finch, humiliated in front of his overseer and his workers, eventually told Peyton that the deal was off, inventing an excuse about Hannah falling ill. But something had shifted at Cypress Bend that day. The other enslaved people had seen that Hannah could be hurt, yes, but they had also seen that she could make Alistair Finch back down. And that knowledge frightened Finch more than he was willing to admit. Over the next year, an uneasy, unspoken equilibrium developed. Finch continued to exhibit Hannah to visitors who came to Cypress Bend, but he stopped trying to take her off the plantation. Hannah continued to work the fields with the same quiet, implacable strength. The punishments continued, but they became less frequent, as if Finch understood that each one diminished his own authority rather than reinforcing it. But beneath the surface of that fragile daily routine, something else was growing. Something that would come to a terrible fruition on a hot September night in 1831 and change everything. Because in the spring of 1830, Hannah became pregnant. The father of Hannah's child was never officially recorded, but the oral testimonies of other enslaved people at Cypress Bend tell a consistent story. His name was Isaac, a man of about 30 years of age who worked as a carpenter on the plantation. Skilled in the intricate woodwork required to maintain the rice mills and the complex floodgate systems, Isaac had arrived at Cypress Bend 2 years before Hannah, purchased from an estate sale in Charleston. He was known as a quiet, thoughtful man, someone who could fix almost anything and who had lost his own wife and daughter when they were sold away from him years earlier. The relationship between Isaac and Hannah was, by all accounts, born from a deep, mutual respect rather than a passionate romance. In a world where so much was taken from them, where their bodies and their labor were owned by someone else, they found in each other something resembling a true partnership. They would sit together in the evenings after the work was done, speaking quietly outside their cabins. Isaac would tell Hannah about the places he had been, the things he had built. And Hannah, who had been moved so many times in her young life that she barely remembered her own mother's face, would listen. When Hannah discovered she was pregnant in early 1830, the news spread quickly through the slave quarters. A pregnancy on a plantation was always a complicated event, representing both a profound hope and a fresh, terrifying horror. A child meant continuity, family, the possibility of something beyond the endless, soul-crushing grind of labor. But it also meant vulnerability. It meant another life that could be threatened, another heart that could be broken. Another human being that could be sold, used as leverage, or destroyed on a whim. And on a plantation owned by someone like Alistair Finch, it meant constant, unrelenting danger. Hannah's pregnancy was difficult from the beginning. Her immense size, the very thing that had made her so valuable to Finch, made carrying a child physically challenging. She continued working in the rice fields through her first months of pregnancy, as all enslaved women were expected to do. But the other women at Cypress Bend noticed that she moved more slowly, that she would sometimes pause in her work and press a hand to her lower back. Her face showing a rare, fleeting flicker of pain, Finch noticed too, but for entirely different reasons. A pregnant slave woman meant, in his cold, brutal calculation, another piece of property. Another person he could own, sell, or use. He began to talk openly about the child, telling visitors that he expected the infant to be of unusual size, given the mother's extraordinary dimensions. He speculated about what price such a child might fetch at auction when it was old enough to be sold. These casual, cruel comments, overheard by the house servants and relayed back to the quarters, filled Hannah with a cold, silent dread that she had never felt before. She had endured beatings, humiliation, exhaustion, and hunger. But the thought of her own child being treated as Finch had treated her, exhibited like an animal, punished for entertainment, and perhaps eventually sold away, was something different, something utterly unbearable. Isaac noticed the change in Hannah. She became even more silent than usual, her face as hard as carved stone, her eyes distant and unreadable. At night, she would sit outside her cabin with her hands on her belly, staring toward the main house with an expression that frightened even those who knew her well. In November of 1830, Hannah was ordered to stop field work and was assigned lighter tasks around the plantation. Shelling rice, mending clothes, working in the kitchen garden. Her belly had grown enormous, and it had become difficult for her to move with her usual ease. But even in this diminished state, she remained an imposing, almost mythic presence. The kitchen workers reported that when Hannah stood in the doorway of the kitchen building, she blocked out the sunlight entirely. The birth came in late January of 1831, during one of the coldest nights of the winter. Hannah went into labor just after midnight, attended by two older enslaved women who served as midwives for the plantation community, a woman named Hester and another named Dinah. The labor was long and extremely difficult. Hannah, who had never cried out during her brutal beatings, screamed that night. The sound carried across the frozen fields and reached the main house, where Finch was awoken by the noise. According to his own later testimony, he lit a lantern and walked to the slave quarters, standing outside cabin number 7 and listening to the sounds of her agony from within. Just before dawn, the baby was born. It was a boy. He was large for a newborn, nearly 11 pounds, but otherwise appeared healthy and perfectly normal. When the baby cried a strong, lusty wail, Hester would later testify that Hannah wept for the first time anyone at Cypress Bend had ever seen. She held her son against her chest, examining his tiny hands, his perfect face, whispering words to him that no one else could hear. Isaac was allowed into the cabin shortly after the birth. He stood beside Hannah, looking down at the child, and those who were present reported that something passed between them in that moment. Some unspoken understanding, some silent, solemn decision. Hannah named her son Jacob. It was a biblical name, common among enslaved people, a name that carried connotations of struggle, of wrestling with God and man, and of survival. For a few brief weeks, despite the constant underlying threat of their world, there was something like happiness in cabin number 7. Hannah would nurse Jacob, hold him for hours, and sing to him in a low, rumbling voice that sounded like distant thunder. Isaac would carve small, intricate toys for the baby, tiny wooden animals that he would place in the cradle he had built with his own hands. But Alistair Finch was watching and waiting. By the summer of 1831, Jacob was 6 months old. He was growing quickly, already larger than most babies his age, and had begun to smile and reach for things with his chubby, curious hands. Hannah had returned to work, but lighter work than before, mostly around the plantation buildings. She kept Jacob with her whenever possible, carrying him in a cloth sling on her hip or on her back while she worked, never letting him out of her sight for long. Isaac had built a better cabin for them, using scrap wood and his carpentry skills to improve the structure, adding a real door with a latch and a small window with shutters. It was still a slave cabin, still barely adequate shelter, but it was theirs. And inside those rough-hewn walls they tried to build something that resembled a family. But in Georgetown, Alistair Finch's finances were deteriorating. The rice market had been unstable for several years, and Finch had made some disastrous investments in a shipping venture that had collapsed, taking a significant portion of his fortune with it. He owed money to multiple creditors, and they were becoming insistent. By July of 1831, Finch was facing the real possibility of losing Cypress Bend entirely if he could not raise a substantial amount of capital, and quickly. The solution in his mind was simple and obvious. He would sell some of his enslaved workers. He could sell 5 or 6 people and clear enough of his debt to stabilize his financial position. The only question was which ones to sell. On a humid Tuesday afternoon in early September, a slave trader named Nathaniel Rawlins arrived at Cypress Bend. Rawlins was well known in the Georgetown market, a man who specialized in purchasing enslaved people from financially troubled planters and then reselling them at auction or to plantation owners further south, in Georgia and Florida. He had a reputation for driving hard bargains and for having no scruples about separating families. Finch and Rawlins spent several hours walking through the plantation, inspecting the enslaved workers, discussing their ages, their skills, and their potential prices. When they reached the area near the kitchen garden where Hannah was working, with Jacob sleeping in a cloth sling on her back, Rawlins stopped and stared. The conversation that followed was overheard by a young boy named Peter, who was supposed to be hauling water but had hidden behind a woodpile close enough to hear. Peter's testimony, given many years later, provides the only direct account of what was said. "Good Lord, Finch," Rawlins said, his eyes wide with a mixture of awe and avarice. "Is that the giant woman I've heard so much about?" "That is Hannah," Finch replied, a note of pride in his voice. 6'8" and the strongest worker I have." "And the child?" Rawlins asked, walking closer, circling Hannah while she continued her work, her face a mask of stone. He seemed particularly interested in Jacob. "Her son," Finch said, "about 6 months old." "How much for the child?" Rawlins asked, his voice casual. Hannah's hands stopped moving. She did not turn around, but her entire body went rigid. "I had not considered selling him separately," Finch said, though the lie was plain on his face. "I have a buyer in Savannah," Rollins said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "A wealthy family looking for a house servant they can train from infancy. They pay premium prices for healthy children, light work, good conditions. I could give you $400 for that baby today, cash." There was a long, heavy silence. Hannah had turned slowly to face them now, still holding her hoe, her face absolutely blank, her eyes unreadable. "400?" Finch asked, his own greed warring with a flicker of something that might have been caution, or even fear. "Today," Rollins said, pressing his advantage. "Cash. I'll take him with me when I leave this afternoon." Peter, the boy behind the woodpile, reported that Hannah made a sound then, a low, guttural noise deep in her throat like a cornered animal. But she did not speak. Finch looked at her, then back at Rollins. "I need to consider this," he said. But everyone who heard that conversation, everyone who saw the look on Finch's face knew the truth. Alistair Finch needed $400 more than he needed to keep a 6-month-old baby on his plantation. It was just a matter of time. That night in cabin number 7, Hannah and Isaac spoke in urgent, desperate whispers until long after the rest of the plantation had fallen into an exhausted sleep. No one knows exactly what they said, what plans they made, what impossible choices they weighed. But the decision they reached would echo through history, a single desperate act of resistance against an unendurable reality. The next morning, September 11th, 1831, Isaac was gone. He had vanished during the night, taking nothing with him except the clothes on his back. An enslaved man running away from a plantation was not unusual, though it was an act of almost suicidal bravery. The roads were constantly patrolled. Professional slave catchers operated throughout the Lowcountry with packs of trained dogs and an arsenal of weapons. The punishment for captured runaways was savage, often ending in death. But Isaac did not run alone. Hidden in the lining of his coat, sewn there by Hannah's own large, steady hands, was a detailed map he had drawn of the plantation, the surrounding area, and the winding, treacherous path to Georgetown. And with the map, there was a letter. The letter was addressed to anyone in Georgetown with a Christian heart. And in it, Isaac explained that Alistair Finch was planning to sell an infant child, separating him from his mother. He begged for intervention, for assistance, for anything that might stop the sale. It was a desperate, almost certainly doomed plan, but it was the only plan they had. Finch was informed of Isaac's disappearance just after dawn. His reaction was explosive. He ordered the overseer, Elias Thorne, to organize a search party immediately, to contact the local slave patrol and to send riders to Georgetown to watch the roads. The plantation was in chaos all morning as men on horseback spread out through the surrounding swamps and fields, searching for any sign of the escaped carpenter. They found him just after noon, about 8 miles from Cypress Bend, trying to cross a wide, shallow creek. The slave patrol's dogs had picked up his scent, and Isaac had left a clear trail through the soft mud near the water's edge. They brought him back to Cypress Bend, bound with ropes, his clothes torn, his arms and legs bleeding from dog bites, but still alive. What happened next became the subject of testimony in multiple legal proceedings over the following months, though the accounts varied depending on who was speaking and when. Finch ordered Isaac to be taken to the whipping post immediately. He announced to the assembled enslaved community that he would personally administer the punishment, and that it would be severe enough to serve as a warning to anyone else who might ever consider running. The entire enslaved community was forced to gather in the main yard and watch. Hannah was made to stand at the very front, holding Jacob in her arms. The punishment was brutal, even by the standards of that time and place. 50 lashes delivered with a heavy, 9-tailed leather whip. Isaac was tied to the post, his shirt torn away. Finch, his face contorted with rage, swung the whip himself, putting his full strength and weight into each stroke. Blood appeared on Isaac's back after the 5th lash. After the 10th, His skin was torn open in multiple places. After the 20th, he had stopped screaming and hung limp and unconscious against the ropes. Hannah watched all of it, her face like carved stone, her arms wrapped so tightly around Jacob that the baby began to cry, frightened by the sounds of the whip and the palpable atmosphere of violence. Witnesses reported that Hannah's eyes never left Isaac's face and that Isaac, in the brief, agonizing moments when he was conscious, looked only at her. When it was over, Isaac was cut down and dragged to his cabin, a broken, barely living man. Finch, his own face flushed and spattered with blood, turned to address the assembled crowd. He announced that anyone who helped a runaway, anyone who even knew about a planned escape and did not report it, would receive the same punishment. Then he dismissed everyone back to work, everyone, that is, except Hannah. Finch approached her, standing so close that she had to look down at him. He was a man of average height, and next to Hannah's towering frame, he looked almost childlike, but his voice was as hard and as cold as a winter stone. "Tomorrow morning," he said, his voice low and menacing, "Mr. Rollins will return and he will take your son. You will not resist. You will hand the child over quietly. If you cause any trouble, if you make any scene, I will have Isaac beaten again. And this time, he will not survive it. Do you understand me?" Hannah said nothing. She simply stared down at Finch with those dark, unreadable eyes. After a long, tense moment, Finch turned and walked back to the main house. That night, the plantation was unnaturally quiet. Even the normal sounds of the swamp, the chirping of crickets, the croaking of frogs, seemed muted, as if the world itself were holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable tragedy. In cabin number 7, Hannah sat on the floor, holding Jacob, rocking him slowly while he slept. In another cabin, Isaac lay on his stomach on a pallet of straw, his shredded back treated with grease and herbs by the other enslaved people, drifting in and out of a feverish, pain-filled consciousness. And in the main house, Alistair Finch sat in his library, going over his account books, calculating how the $400 from the sale of the infant Jacob would ease his immediate financial pressures. He drank brandy and occasionally looked out the window toward the slave quarters. His face troubled despite his certainty that he had made the right and only decision. None of them knew that the next night would end in blood, mystery, and a legend that would never truly be solved. September 12, 1831, dawned hot and oppressively humid, the kind of Lowcountry summer day where the air feels thick enough to choke on. The sun rose blood-red over the rice fields, its light filtered through the thick haze of moisture rising from the swamps. Later, people would remember that detail as if nature itself had been warning them of what was to come. Hannah rose before dawn, as she always did. She nursed Jacob, changed him, and dressed him in the cleanest clothes she had, a small cotton gown she had sewn herself. She held him close and whispered to him for a long time, words that no one else heard. Then she carefully placed him in the wooden cradle that Isaac had made, and she went to work. All morning, Hannah worked in the kitchen garden with a kind of mechanical, unnerving efficiency. The other women working near her reported that she spoke to no one, acknowledged no one, simply moved through her tasks with her clean, expressionless, and her movements precise and deliberate. Several people tried to speak to her to offer a word of sympathy or support, but she did not respond. It was as if she had retreated somewhere deep inside herself, to a place where no one could reach her. Around mid-morning, Nathaniel Rollins, the slave trader, arrived at Cypress Bend in a wagon driven by his assistant. Rollins went directly to the main house and was shown into Finch's library, where the two men finalized their transaction. $400 in cash was exchanged for a set of ownership papers. Hastily written up for an infant named Jacob, age 6 months, property of Alistair Finch, now sold to Nathaniel Rollins. At noon, Finch sent word that Hannah should bring the child to the main house. The message was delivered by a house servant named Clara, who had the unenviable task of walking to the kitchen garden and telling Hannah that it was time to give up her son. Hannah's reaction was unexpected. She simply nodded. She put down her hoe, wiped her hands on her dress, and walked calmly to cabin number 7. She emerged a few minutes later carrying Jacob, who was awake and looking around with wide, curious eyes. She walked toward the main house without hurrying, without hesitating, her face still showing no emotion at all. The other enslaved people watched her go, many of them weeping silently. Some expected her to run, to fight, to do something, anything. But Hannah just walked steadily across the yard, up the steps of the main house, and disappeared inside. What happened in the next 15 minutes comes from multiple testimonies, primarily from Clara, who was present in the house, and from the overseer, Elias Thorne, who was called inside during the exchange. Hannah entered the library where Finch and Rollins were waiting. She stood just inside the doorway, holding Jacob tightly against her chest. Finch gestured for her to approach. She took 3 slow, deliberate steps forward and stopped. The men waited for her to come closer, but she did not move. After a long, uncomfortable silence, Finch spoke. "Hannah, give the child to Mr. Rollins." Hannah looked at Rollins, then back at Finch. In a voice so quiet they had to strain to hear it, she said, "Please." It was the first time anyone at Cypress Bend had ever heard Hannah beg for anything. Finch's face hardened. "The matter is settled, Hannah. Give him the child now." Hannah's arms tightened around Jacob. Her voice rose slightly, though it still held no tremor. "Please, I will work harder. I will do anything. Please do not take my child." Rollins shifted uncomfortably. Finch stood up from behind his desk, his voice sharp and cold. "You forget yourself. You do not beg. You obey. Hand over the child this instant." For a long moment, Hannah did not move. Then slowly she looked down at Jacob. She kissed his forehead. She whispered something to him that no one could hear. And then, with hands that were shaking for the first time anyone had ever seen, she held him out toward Rollins. Rollins stepped forward and took Jacob from her arms. The baby, sensing the change, began to cry, a wail that seemed to break something in the room. Hannah's face crumpled for just a second, showing a flash of raw, unbearable anguish before she forced it back into its usual mask of blankness. But her hands, now empty, remained extended, as if she could not quite comprehend that they no longer held her son, Finch. Perhaps feeling a twinge of something like guilt, or perhaps just wanting the scene to be over, said, his voice a little softer now, "The child will be well cared for, Hannah. He goes to a good situation. You will work, and perhaps in time you can have other children. Now, go back to your work." Hannah lowered her hands slowly. She looked at Finch with an expression that Clara would later describe as being beyond hatred, beyond despair, something cold and final. Then she turned and walked out of the library, out of the main house, and back toward the slave quarters. Rollins left Cypress Bend shortly after noon with Jacob wrapped in a blanket in the back of his wagon, crying for his mother. Hannah was seen standing near cabin number 7, watching the wagon roll down the long, oak-lined driveway toward the main road. She stood there motionless for nearly an hour after the wagon had disappeared from sight. The afternoon passed in a strange, tense atmosphere. Everyone at Cypress Bend knew that something terrible had occurred, but the brutal routines of plantation life continued regardless. The work had to be done. The rice would not harvest itself. So people returned to the fields, to their tasks, moving mechanically through the motions while their minds were elsewhere. Hannah returned to work as well. But something had changed. Several people later testified that her movements seemed different, more deliberate, almost ritualistic. She worked steadily through the afternoon, refusing food when it was offered, speaking to no one. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in deep, bloody oranges and purples, she finally stopped working. She walked to the cabin where Isaac lay, still recovering from his brutal beating. She entered without knocking and sat on the floor beside his pallet. Isaac was awake, his face drawn with pain, but his eyes were alert. According to the testimony of others in the cabin who pretended to sleep but listened to every word, Hannah and Isaac spoke in low voices for nearly an hour. The exact words they said were never recorded, but the tone was described as final, as if they were saying goodbye. At one point, Isaac reached out and took Hannah's hand in his, and they sat like that in silence for a long, long time. When Hannah finally stood to leave, Isaac said something that several people heard clearly. "You do what you have to do." Hannah returned to cabin number 7 as full darkness descended. She did not eat the evening meal. She sat on the floor, her back against the rough-hewn wall, staring at the empty cradle that Isaac had built. Her face, illuminated by the dim, flickering light of a single candle, was a mask of unreadable emotion. Around 9 o'clock, she stood up, blew out the candle, and left the cabin. Several people saw her walking across the plantation grounds, moving through the darkness toward the main house. Her figure was unmistakable even at a distance, towering and moving with that strange, quiet, deliberate grace. An elderly field worker named Solomon later testified that he called out to her, asking where she was going. Hannah did not answer. She simply kept walking. At approximately 9:30, according to the clock that would later be found. Stopped at that exact time in Alistair Finch's library, Hannah Cole entered the main house through the unlocked kitchen door. The main house at Cypress Bend was quiet that night. Alistair Finch, having successfully sold off a piece of his property to alleviate his financial pressures, had dismissed most of the house servants earlier than usual. He kept only Clara and one other servant, an older man named Joseph, who served as his butler. Finch himself was in his library, the same room where he had torn Jacob from Hannah's arms just 9 hours earlier. He was working on his account books, occasionally sipping from a glass of brandy, reviewing the entries that now included a credit of $400 from the sale. Clara was upstairs in one of the bedrooms, turning down the bed and preparing the room for the night. Joseph was in the kitchen building, which was separate from the main house, as was common in plantation architecture, finishing the cleaning from the evening meal. Neither of them saw Hannah enter through the kitchen door and move like a ghost through the darkened house, her bare feet making no sound on the polished wooden floors, her destination clear and certain. What happened in the next several minutes has been reconstructed from the physical evidence found at the scene, from the testimonies of those who arrived shortly after, and from one crucial, terrified witness. Clara, who heard the sounds from downstairs and came to investigate. According to Clara's testimony given 3 days later to the Georgetown magistrate, she heard Finch's voice first raised in anger but not quite shouting. She could not make out the words, but the tone was sharp and commanding. Then she heard another voice, much lower, a rumbling, quiet sound that she recognized immediately as Hannah's. Clara started down the main staircase, moving quietly, uncertain whether she should intervene or not. As she reached the bottom of the stairs, she heard Finch shout, his voice now laced with a note of alarm. "How dare you enter this house? Get out immediately, or I will have you whipped until you cannot stand." Hannah's response was too quiet for Clara to hear clearly, but it caused Finch to shout again, his voice cracking with a mixture of rage and fear. "The child is sold. The matter is finished. You have no rights here. You own nothing, not even yourself." There was a sound then that Clara described as furniture scraping across the floor, as if a heavy chair had been pushed back suddenly. Then Finch's voice again, but different now, higher, thinner, laced with a dawning terror. "Stay back. Do not come any closer. I am warning you, woman." Clara, terrified but compelled by some instinct she could not name, moved to a position where she could see through the partially open library door. What she saw, she would later say, would stay with her for the rest of her life, a tableau of horror etched into her memory. Hannah stood in the center of the library, her massive frame seeming to fill the entire room, her head nearly touching the high ceiling. Finch had backed up against his heavy mahogany desk, his face pale with terror, one hand reaching behind him as if searching for something. The oil lamp on the desk cast wild dancing shadows, making Hannah's figure seem even larger, almost inhuman in its proportions. "I want my son back," Hannah said. Her voice was perfectly calm, perfectly steady, a low, quiet rumble that was more terrifying than any shout. "Impossible," Finch stammered, his eyes wide with fear. "He is sold. The law supports me. You are my property, and that child was my property, and I had every right to—" "I want my son back," Hannah repeated, her voice unchanged. Finch's hand found what he was searching for, a small pearl-handled pistol he kept in the top drawer of his desk. He pulled it out and pointed it at Hannah with a hand that shook so violently he could barely aim. "I will shoot you if you take another step," he shrieked. "I swear before God I will shoot you where you stand." Hannah looked at the pistol, then back at Finch. She took a slow, deliberate step forward. "Stop!" Finch's voice cracked. "I will do it. I will!" Hannah took another step. She was close enough now that she could have reached out and touched him. Finch pulled the trigger. The sound of the gunshot was deafening in the enclosed space. Clara screamed, but when the smoke cleared, Hannah was still standing. The ball had struck her in the left shoulder, tearing through muscle and striking bone, but she had not fallen. She had barely moved. A dark stain was spreading across the rough cotton of her dress, black in the lamplight. But her face showed no sign of pain, only that same terrible, blank determination. Finch stared at her in utter horror. He tried to cock the pistol again for a second shot, but his hands were shaking too badly. Hannah reached out and took the pistol from his hands as easily as one might take a toy from a frightened shoulder. She threw it across the room where it struck the wall and clattered to the floor. "Where is my son?" Hannah asked, her voice still quiet, still steady. I do not know," Finch whispered, his body pressed against the desk with nowhere to go. "Rollins took him. I do not know where. I swear I do not know." Hannah stood there for a long, silent moment, looking down at the terrified man who had destroyed her life. Blood was now dripping from her shoulder, pattering softly on the floor. When she spoke again, her voice was so quiet that Clara could barely hear it. "You took everything from me. You took my body, my labor, my dignity, my child. You took everything. What do you have left for me to take?" "Please," Finch whispered, his eyes wide with a terror that went beyond the fear of death. "Please, I can get him back. I can find him. I can—" But Hannah was not listening anymore. She reached out with both her hands and took Alistair Finch by the head, her enormous hands wrapping completely around his skull, the way a person might hold a melon. Finch tried to scream, but the sound was cut off almost instantly. Clara turned and ran. She ran out of the house, across the yard, screaming for help, for anyone, for God. Behind her, from inside the library, she heard a sound she would later describe to the magistrate as being like a pumpkin being smashed against a stone wall, followed by the heavy, wet thump of something large falling to the floor. By the time the overseer, Elias Thorne, and 2 other men arrived at the main house, perhaps 3 minutes later, the library was silent. They entered cautiously, Thorne carrying a rifle, expecting to find a scene of ongoing violence. What they found was worse than violence. It was finality. Alistair Finch lay on the floor beside his desk, on his back, his eyes open and staring at nothing. His head was misshapen, crushed with such force that blood and brain matter had sprayed across the desk, the nearby books, and the wall behind him. The physical evidence was unmistakable. He had been killed by a massive compression force, applied by hands of extraordinary size and strength, squeezing his skull until it fractured and collapsed inward. Hannah was gone. The window behind the desk, which looked out over the back of the property toward the dark, impenetrable swamps, was open. A trail of blood led from Finch's body to the window and out into the blackness beyond. The men stood in shocked silence for a moment, trying to comprehend what they were seeing. Then Thorne took control. He sent one man to ride to Georgetown immediately to alert the authorities. He sent another to gather all the enslaved men to form a search party. He posted guards at the main house to preserve the scene. But even as he gave these orders, Thorne knew in his heart that they would not find Hannah Cole. The swamps around Cypress Bend were vast, dark, and treacherous. A person who knew them well could disappear into that wilderness and never be found. And Hannah had just killed a white plantation owner in front of a witness. She had nothing left to lose. The search began within the hour, but it was a chaotic and disorganized affair. Men with torches and dogs spread out into the swamps, calling out, crashing through the dense underbrush. They found the blood trail easily enough, a series of dark droplets leading away from the house into the rice fields and then toward the forbidding tree line of the swamp. But at the very edge of the swamp, the trail simply disappeared. The ground was too wet, too tangled with roots and vegetation, and in the darkness. It was impossible to track anything with any certainty. They searched all night and into the next day, but they found nothing. No body, no torn clothing, no sign that Hannah had been there at all. Except for that chilling blood trail that ended so abruptly at the swamp's edge, like a line drawn in the sand between the world of men and the wild, untamed world beyond. As dawn broke on September 13th, the searchers returned to Cypress Bend exhausted, muddy, and empty-handed. The Georgetown authorities arrived that afternoon, led by a magistrate named William Drayton, accompanied by the sheriff, 2 deputies, and a physician named Dr. James Pringle. What they found was a plantation in chaos, with the enslaved community terrified and silent, the overseer overwhelmed, and a crime scene that defied easy explanation. Dr. Pringle's examination of Alistair Finch's body was thorough and disturbing. His official report, preserved in the Georgetown County Archives, describes injuries consistent with massive compression force applied to the cranium, resulting in multiple fractures, brain hemorrhage, and immediate death. The doctor noted that the marks on Finch's skull corresponded to fingers of unusual length and width, and that the force required to produce such injuries would exceed the capacity of most men, requiring a strength of an extraordinary nature. The investigation focused initially on finding Hannah, but as the days passed with no trace of her, the authorities began to interview everyone at Cypress Bend. The testimonies they collected painted a disturbing picture of life on the plantation and of Hannah herself. Clara gave her account of what she had witnessed, though she was clearly terrified of the consequences. Her testimony was corroborated by Joseph, who had heard the gunshot and had seen Hannah's bloody trail leading from the house. Other enslaved people testified about Hannah's size, her strength, the years of abuse she had suffered, and the sale of her child on the morning of the murder. The discovery of the gunshot wound complicated matters. The authorities found the pistol where Hannah had thrown it and the ball lodged in the wall behind where she had been standing. This meant that Finch had shot Hannah before she killed him, which raised uncomfortable legal questions about self-defense. Could an enslaved person claim self-defense against their owner? The law said no, but the circumstances of the case made even the most hardened magistrates uneasy. Isaac was questioned extensively. He was still recovering from his brutal beating, barely able to sit up, but the authorities suspected he knew something about Hannah's whereabouts. He maintained that he had been in his cabin all night, too injured to move, and knew nothing of what Hannah had done until he heard the commotion afterward. Several other enslaved people confirmed his story. The authorities had no choice but to accept it, though they remained deeply suspicious. As word of the murder spread through Georgetown and the surrounding Lowcountry, public reaction was divided and intense. Among the plantation-owning class, there was outrage and fear. If an enslaved woman could kill her owner and then simply disappear, what did that mean for the stability of the entire system? Emergency meetings were called. Patrols were increased. New, even harsher restrictions were placed on the movements of enslaved people. But among other, communities, particularly free black people and those opposed to slavery. The story of Hannah Cole took on different dimensions. For some, she became a symbol of resistance, a figure of righteous maternal rage. For others, she was a cautionary tale about the inevitable violence that the institution of slavery produced. For still others, she was simply a mother who had been pushed beyond the limits of human endurance. The search for Hannah continued for weeks, expanding far beyond Cypress Bend. Slave catchers were hired, rewards were posted, and reports began to come in from across the region of sightings of a woman matching Hannah's distinctive appearance. A woman of extraordinary height, seen near the Santee River, a giant woman spotted on a road leading north toward North Carolina, a tall woman asking for food at a church in the back country. But none of these sightings were ever confirmed. When investigators followed up, they found nothing. It was as if Hannah had been swallowed by the landscape itself, becoming a part of the swamps and forests that surrounded Cypress Bend. She had become a ghost, a legend, a story told in whispers around fires on cold nights. Then in October of 1831, something unexpected happened. A letter arrived at the Georgetown magistrate's office. It had no return address and had been left at a post office in Columbia, over 100 miles from Georgetown. The handwriting was crude but legible, the spelling uncertain but understandable. It read, "To those who are seeking the woman Hannah, I am not dead. I will never return. I am going north to find my son. If any man tries to stop me, he will meet the same fate as Alistair Finch. Do not follow me." The letter was not signed, but Magistrate Drayton was convinced it was authentic. The phrasing, the determination, the chilling threat. It all seemed consistent with what he knew of Hannah, but it raised more questions than it answered. Had Hannah really made it all the way to Columbia? Was she still alive, despite her gunshot wound? And most troubling of all, did she really intend to search for her son? The authorities did not publicize the letter. They feared it would inspire other enslaved people or create a panic among the plantation owners. But they shared it confidentially with slave traders and catchers across the region, asking them to be on the lookout for a woman of Hannah's description, particularly one asking questions about a child named Jacob who had been sold in September. Nathaniel Rawlins, the trader who had purchased Jacob, was questioned extensively. He confirmed that he had sold the child to a family named Haverford in Savannah, Georgia for $500, just 2 days after leaving Cypress Bend. The Haverfords were contacted. They confirmed that they had purchased an infant boy in mid-September and that the child was healthy and in their possession. But they were, understandably, alarmed by the story of Hannah and what she had done. They hired armed guards to watch their property for months afterward. As 1831 turned to 1832, and then to 1833, the active search for Hannah gradually ceased. She had not been found. She had not been reported anywhere with any certainty. The authorities concluded that she had most likely died from her gunshot wound somewhere in the vast, untamed wilderness. Her body, they assumed, had never been recovered. The case was officially closed, though a standing warrant for her arrest remained on the books for decades. But the story of Hannah Cole did not end there, because over the years, over the decades, the rumors, the whispers, the legends persisted. The story of the giant slave woman of Georgetown had only just begun.